We had the great pleasure of being joined this evening by a writer, host of the Give Them an Argument podcast and YouTube show, and the author of a new book called Christopher Hitchens, What He Got Right, How He Went Wrong, and Why He Still Matters. Ben Burgis. Thanks for joining us, Ben. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, kid.
Absolutely. So I'll start with a very boring question, which is why Hitchens as a topic for a book?
Sure. So I started to think about this after a segment that I did with Michael Brooks on his show, Michael Brooks show, which we were just talking about before we went live. That was like, I think, we'd done a couple of these, that there was a while when once everything went on Zoom, with the pandemic and all that, we'd start doing these throwback clips after we did the regular segment that I was doing on Tuesday nights, and a few of them were Hitchens things, right? And after we did one of them, which I believe it was the one where of Hitchens in 2002 with Andrew Sullivan, I started thinking that it would be interesting to write a book about him, and that because we were, I thought when the book came out, right, would be just about the 10-year anniversary of his passing on the dot, that this would be a time where people would be receptive to that. But look, I will admit that in some ways this is the most self-indulgent reason I've ever written a book, which is that he's somebody I find fascinating, and he wrote about a lot of topics, was engaged in a lot of debates that are super interesting to me, and I wanted to sort out some of those mixed feelings that I have about him as a figure. And my hope obviously is that lots of other people will also find it interesting, but by comparison to other books that I've read, it's much less here's this sort of urgent political intervention, and more hey, this is really interesting to me, maybe it will be to you too.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the first chapter of the book, you sort of speculate as to what he would have thought about the 2016 Democratic primary. And I had just done a Hitchens binge in the run up to that primary. It just happens to be because I was home all the time. I work with a laptop on, so I would just stream his debates in the background and things like that. And I started thinking the same thing, end of 2015, early 2016. Okay, I knew he hated the Clintons. I started watching some videos about why he hated them, and I knew he, was a socialist for much of his life. But I wasn't sure he'd be completely sold on Sanders' candidacy either. So I was thinking the exact same thing that you lay out in that first chapter of the book. So what are your thoughts on that? Where do you think he would have come down on that question? Because we all know how he felt about Bill, and but I think you rightly point out that he would have had certain hangups about Bernie as well.
Yeah, no question. I think that I think one of the reasons I started with that is that it sort of in a weird way, it feels like if you're going to speculate about if he'd been cancer in 2011, what positions might he have taken later, it's a little bit easier to have 2016 as the entry point than to have 2021 as the entry point, because it's only 5 years after his death, or really the beginning of that campaign is more 4 years after his death,
Right.
So it's a little the world had changed a lot less by then, right? That it has
right.
between his death and now. And of course, another reason is that a lot of the sort of core audience, the stuff that I write, is that's an event that's of particular interest to them and me, right? Because that's sort of the beginning of the kind of wave of resurgent socialist politics that that we have in the United States right now. So I thought it'd be an interesting way to situate him. And yeah, I think that one thing that we know for sure, right, is that I think there's no version of Hitchens that ever would have been even remotely pro-Trump. Sometimes people will say that because I think they don't really get what he thought, right? They just sort of say, contrarian, edgy, whatever, would have liked Trump. But I think I think they're missing the boat. I think if you know anything about like really almost any of his views, like you know that that wouldn't happen. But I think there are like a range of non-Trumpist positions he might have taken.
Well, yeah, sure.
Uh,
I mean, he wasn't even sold on Obama that well in 2008, but he said, like, almost an exact quote is that no serious person could vote for John McCain given Sarah Palin
yeah,
was running me, and so I think he would have felt a similar way about Trump. Like, this is just not a serious choice.
yeah, exactly. And like and also I think that like he did like really, really hate like nationalism and racism and nativism, and like these are like really important hatreds to him, right? You know, that these are up there with organized religion, you know, the list of things he doesn't like. And and I think that, you know, and if you look at his commentary on like the Tea Party movement, you know, at the beginning of the Obama years, or like that Glenn Beck rally in Washington, D.C., he wrote an article about, I think for Slate, where he called it the water world of white self-pity. You know, that like, you know, like I think he would have like the whole, you know, the MAGA thing, I think would have like repulsed him on like every level. You know, like I think if he, even if you assume that he'd maintained all of his worst positions from the last 10 years of his life, you know, I think it still would have repulsed him. But if you think about the range of positions they might take it, I think that like, look, the worst kind of version of Hitchens I could imagine in the Trump years would have been like, you know, basically like a sort of high-end version of like a pretty annoying resistance liberal, right? Like I think that that's something that unfortunately is not like outside of the realm of imagination, you
No,
know,
or
as,
even like a Lincoln Project guy.
yeah, totally.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like sort of on the Lincoln Project end of that, you know,
right.
that political project. Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. But I think there are some reasons to think that there's also a possible version of him who would have sided with Bernie, although it's not clear cut for reasons that you kind of hint at there, right? So, so what's the case for thinking that, you know, I mean, the reason it's not clear cut is that, you know, Hitchens did take these terrible foreign policy positions that were extremely important to him in the last decade of his life, and I think he would have had, like, just psychologically, you know, no matter how much longer he'd lived, it would have been incredibly difficult for him to walk those positions back, because this was such a huge break between him and so many of his former friends and comrades that, like, I think just like admitting, you know, like acknowledging that they were right and he was wrong might have just been like a more than it's possible to imagine him do it, right? You know, like I think Christopher Hitchens had a larger ego than average, and but I think even for somebody with a more average sized ego or level of stubbornness, right? You know, like I think after you have a break that's hard, that's that like sharp from the people that you've lived with before, say, no, actually, never mind, I guess I was wrong, right? Like I think that's, I can't really imagine that.
Well, you wrote in the book. I mean, one of the last chapters, right? You mentioned how some C-SPAN talking head kind of bullied him into remaining a socialist because the guy would just kind of insist he call himself that, and Hitchens didn't want to give him the satisfaction of like saying, "Well, no, I'm not fully on board with that anymore."
Yeah, exactly. That he admits, I think, in a sort of very honest moment of introspection, and in his memoir Hitch 22, that in retrospect, you know, in that kind of end of history period in the 90s, when it really seemed to most people like, you know, all of these 20th century capitalism versus socialism debates were just over and capitalism won, you know, you know, I think it's very clear to me. It's like the timing is a little unclear, but like I think that, you know, that like one big strand of what happened to him is that like that atmosphere just kind of got to him, right? You know, and he was having a harder and harder time sort of holding out hope that socialism was really on the table, you know, as a historical prospect at that point. But yeah, in this moment of like, you know, introspection and in Hitch 22, he says that like he actually thinks he might have like sort of given up the ghost like a couple of years earlier, except that every time he went on C-SPAN, Brian Lamb would ask him in a condescending way, you know, Christopher, are you still a socialist? And he didn't want to give him the satisfaction of saying, no, you know, I agree with you now. And so,
Right.
yeah, I think it would have been incredibly difficult for him to walk that, you know, to walk those like 2000s foreign policy positions back, which means that if he had extended some level of support to the Bernie left, it would have been despite that. and it would have been complicated because of that. But might he have anyway? I actually think maybe, right? I think for a couple of reasons. One is, as you say, he really, really hated the Clintons. There's tons of stuff about Hillary in that book. No one left to lie to. And there are a lot of things that came up in that campaign about her record, in the Clinton administration, that are things that he writes about in that book. That she said, she was like fighting to give everybody health care in 1993. And he like really savages like, what she was doing actually in that in 1993, and how she just like rejected single payer out of hand, that like, was it the guy from the Physicians for National Health Plan like was in her office and was like, so we've got this thing and it's been rated by the Congressional Budget Office, it has all this popular support. She's like, yeah, tell me something interesting, right? And she just rejected that out of hand. He really goes into grisly detail in that book about like the Dickensian horrors of so-called welfare reform in the 90s. And so I think that already is some reason to think that the sort of like old style, social democratic, economic policies that Bernie was promoting, that Hillary was shooting on in the campaign, that he might have felt some pull towards the Bernie end. But like, I think the biggest thing that makes me think that he might have taken that position is that Henry Kissinger became an issue in that campaign, and Hitchens to the end of his life. I mean, he hated Henry Kissinger more than he hated anyone in the world, right? Like I think if a genie gave him a choice between like, Osama bin Laden is going to die and Henry Kissinger is going to die, at the very least, he would have had to think about it. Right. And he might have chosen to spare Osama. So, so Kissinger could die, like, because he just spent so much time over the years writing about all of these war crimes and crimes against humanity, and, having journalists kidnapped and overthrowing democratically elected, left-wing governments, that Kissinger was involved in. And even like Hitchens's worst positions, part of how he understood this in his head was that he was rejecting this kind of like cynical Kissingerian realism that led the US to support despotic regimes around the world in favor of thinking that we should be spreading democracy. And so I think that when Kissinger became an issue in that campaign, and Hillary talked about how Kissinger was her friend and a trusted advisor, and Bernie, I do a terrible Bernie. I'm not going to try to do the accent.
I've never been friends with Henry Kissinger.
There you go. Perfect. I think that at the very least, that would have tempted him in that, Hitchens in that direction.
Well, the thing that it's so funny, and this is why I love the first chapter of the book so much, is because, I was regrettably late to get involved in that primary, because I knew of Bernie. I had seen him on like the Bill Maher show and stuff, and I liked Bernie. But I was just of the opinion, there's no way this guy's going to break through and win. And so, yeah, it'd be nice, but, what am I going to kill myself over this? This is not going to happen, right? What got me off the mat was something that I think may have gotten Hitchens off the mat, because Hitchens, when he talks about the Clintons, he really talks about how cruel they were. He talks about the execute. I'm thinking of the guy's name. Ricky Ray Rector, the execution of a mentally, basically a lobotomized black man, who was killed. He talks about the crime bill, just the horrible treatment of African Americans throughout their life. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, who we should say, like at the time that he was executed, because he was essentially, he was essentially lobotomized in the course of, of the sequence of events leading up to him going to jail, by bullet wound, but he was so severely mentally ill, mentally handicapped, at the time that he was killed, that like some reports he asked for part of his last meal to be set aside for later. He seems to have, he was helping his executioners find a vein, to inject, because as Hitchens says in that book, right, this is many people that kind of living at the edges, the bottom of society, Ricky Ray Rector, prison is one of the few places they actually get the access to doctors, and that this is he just assumed that these are doctors, they're there to help him somehow. So this is like just really grotesque. And like Bill Clinton actually not only like signs off on executing this guy as governor of Arkansas, but he flies back to Arkansas to make a show of executing Ricky Ray Rector to score points in the campaign about how he was tough on crime.
Right. And so Hitchens really hated that. He really took a special issue with that. And I remember an op-ed in January 2016 came out by David Brock, one of the Clinton, hitmen. The headline was "Black Lives Don't Matter to Bernie Sanders." And the reason he wrote that is because Bernie's ad with the Simon and Garfunkel song had rally crowds in Iowa and New Hampshire, where it's mostly white people at the rallies. And Brock puts this piece out, and I'm thinking, Hitchens will be really incensed by this, because it's just a complete distortion of the truth. And, whatever he may have felt about Bernie, he would certainly say this guy has infinitely more credibility as a civil rights activist than this self-proclaimed Goldwater girl now has one of her junkyard dogs putting out pieces that Black Lives don't matter to Bernie Sanders when he was protesting segregation in the South while she was, like I just said, a Goldwater girl. And so like that struck me at the time. I was like, you know what? These people are just out of control. Like I have to get involved in some way to try and stop this. I was actually more motivated by hatred of her and her campaign and everything it represented than I was by any realistic sense that Bernie could win, because I didn't think it was possible. So people,
well, I mean, you're a good company. I don't think Bernie thought he could win either at the beginning of that primary. I think he kind of realized, like, a couple of caucuses and primaries in, that he actually had a shot, and then started to really go for it. But yeah, I think I should say also parenthetically about David Brock, right, that this is a guy who, whatever, nobody gives you any, gold stars for this, but like I do feel sort of proud of calling this, because I remember, I don't even know, 15 years ago or something, like when Brock first announced that he was a liberal now, and he did like an interview with I don't even remember, like Bill Maher or somebody, to say that he'd seen the error of his ways, which, because this was the guy who, like, I believe Brock is the one who, back when he was a Republican, coined the "a little bit slutty and a little bit nutty" line about Anita Hill. This is who he was, right? So he did this interview, with Bill Maher or somebody, saying that like he'd seen the error of his ways and he was a liberal now. And I remember, like, I was watching it with a couple of friends, and they both thought that like this was sincere, and I remember my reaction at the time. I was like, okay, well, maybe in 5 years he could do another one when he decides that, that like the play now is to say that he's seen the error of his ways and he's a conservative again, because it was just so obvious to me that this was just this like bottomlessly cynical operator, and like seeing the kind of stuff he was pulling in the 2016 election was like, yeah, called that.
Yeah, no, just the low life of all low lives. Unbelievable. So anyway, you talked about how Hitchens sort of made this transformation sort of away from socialism in the sort of end of history period, how he kind of came to a realization that maybe the socialist revolutions that he had believed in as a younger man, he didn't think were possible anymore. And that, I thought, was a really insightful sort of possible explanation that could have explained some of his shift towards being, more of a neocon in his later years, more so than any sort of like hatred of religion or anything like that. You offer up some of those explanations, but I'll just read a brief passage from the book here regarding the way you write about his transformation from like being a committed socialist to basically a Bush-aligned, neocon in the last 10 years of his life. My best guess about all of this is that the passage in Hitch 22 was Hitchens' introspectively honest reflection on the change. He abandoned the socialist cause not because he no longer thought that the more enlightened application of the idea in the non-capitalist future he'd talked about in the debate with Biswanger and Ridpath, I'm not sure if I'm getting those names right, was desirable, but because it no longer seemed realistically possible that such a future would ever come about. By the time Hitchens' politics shifted, he'd spent much of his life as a globe-trotting journalist, getting to know people who lived under despotic regimes. During the decades when his radical left convictions were intact, he presumably believed that some fresh wave of socialist revolutions would one day sweep those regimes into the dustbin of history. When he gave up on that, he still wasn't ready to give up hope on there being some other path to democratic transformation. And I think that's a good explanation as to why he may have embraced something like the Iraq War, because I think he really thought it could work. I think he bought into the Rumsfeld line, which is like, yeah, we'll be there 6 days, 6 weeks, maybe 6 months, you know? And so I think that's a really good point. Like, as he became more discouraged about the prospect of sort of like bottom up liberation via like socialist revolutions, he thought, well, certainly the American military has the might to make a world a better place. So if there's a way we can do good by bombing somewhere, I can back that, because he saw that as something that could work. He believed in the like imperial might of the U.S. And so I think that was a really good insight.
Yeah, thank you. I should say, yeah, I mean, there's no question in my mind that he sincerely believed that, which is also part of why, you know, one of many reasons I was interested in going back and kind of exploring Hitchens a bit, that I was very unsatisfied with the kinds of explanations of his political shift that I tended to see from lefties. And I think there's this thing that people in the left often do where we kind of fall into thinking that like everybody in the world either, you know, just has like evil beliefs or secretly agrees with us. And if they're saying they don't agree with us, that's because like they're grifters.
They have some ulterior motive, right?
Yeah, exactly. And don't get me wrong, you know, Dave Brock exists, you know, Dave Rubin exists. Like, you know, it's I'm not saying no one anywhere is grifting, you know, but like I think that, but I think that like having that be the default assumption every time like somebody has a conclusion that we find horrible, and you know that is horrible, right? You know, I think just makes us dumber, you know, because we, you know, we never like kind of take the time to think about like, okay, how is it that somebody could become sincerely convinced of these conclusions that we hate? I think it makes us less able to engage with people, you know, who disagree with us, and it's a huge mistake. I think that I think in Hitchens' case, yeah, I think like, so this idea that people, you know, like people will suggest all these like, okay, so there's the like he just liked being on CNN too much kind of explanation, you know, there's the people, you know, that like, you know, there's just sort of like there's this like pretty bad Norman Finkelstein essay and like whatever. I think I admire the kind of stand that Norman Finkelstein has taken, you know, on Palestinian rights and the professional consequences he's had to pay for that. And like, if he wants to be salty about somebody who is like very visibly on the wrong side of a related issue, I don't like begrudge him that, right? You know, but like, I think analytically it was a pretty bad essay, which is where he kind of like says, oh, this is just part of this tradition of like left-wing apostasy where people, you know, announce, oh, I was wrong about everything, you know, and now I see the light and I'm a right-winger. It's like, no, I mean, like, this is just descriptively not remotely accurate, right? You know, he didn't say he's wrong about everything. In fact, he continued to defend as much as could possibly be defended of everything that he'd always believed that he could like kind of reconcile with what he believed now. He always played up the continuities. And
he didn't even really feel there was much to reconcile in his mind. His stance was pretty consistent with the, you know, everything he felt up, you know, right up till that point.
Yeah, exactly. Like to his mind, right? I think that like part of the, you know, the other part I think of how I could understand this like apparently dramatic transition, which like I actually think was a long time coming, you know, like by the time September 11th happened, I mean, it, you know, like there had already been, you know, like almost a decade of him, like his views starting to shift to some extent, right? You know, he was still calling himself a socialist in the 90s. The overall tenor of the way he would talk about America's role in the world in the 90s was still very negative. But he had started to make compromises with his anti-interventionism, like big compromises, you know, pretty early in the 90s. And I also think it's telling as far as people who think, oh, it's just that like his militant atheism led to Islamophobia, led to support for these wars, that the first war where he's like warming up to the idea that the US military can be a force for good in the world is not one where we're bombing Muslims. It's one where the US in the 90s
Right.
was intervening on behalf of Muslims in Bosnia against Serbian Christians. And I think that a big part of this is that why he thought that there was so much continuity, right? Like, and again, I'm not going to deny the guy had a giant ego, or that he wouldn't want to admit, like the, various things, right? Like that's not a hill I'm going to die on here, right? But like, I think that why he did very sincerely believe there are all these continuities is that like in like the 80s and, going into the 90s when he's like writing, and then like, even like at the end of the 90s, the Kissinger book, right? When he's writing about the evils of US foreign policy, like the big thing that he gets passionate about is how the US is backing these like thuggish, like death squatty kind of authoritarian right-wing regimes around the world. And so if George W. Bush had been fighting, like against, if he'd been like bombing like peasant communist revolutionaries, like LBJ was in Vietnam, or, Reagan was in Nicaragua, then there's no way that Hitchens ever would have supported that, right? But in his mind, this seemed like a big reversal to him, because he starts to look at this like post-Cold War world and say, look at how much has changed, right? My values are the same, but the world has changed. That they look at Slobodan Milosevic, look at Saddam Hussein, look at the Taliban. Are these forces more similar to the kinds of forces that the United States was fighting against in earlier decades, or on the contrary, are these exactly the kind of forces that the United States was like backing in like these dirty wars in Latin America and elsewhere? And of course, in some cases, literally, people that the U.S. was backing in the 80s, were targets of these wars. And so, to his mind, support for these same values, led him to say, okay, look, if I hate these fascists, right, I should continue to hate them and continue to oppose them when the U.S. is bombing them. And I think that like where that goes wrong is, I guess basically two ways, right? Like I think where that chain of reasoning just like completely goes off the cliff is, one, that I think as he understood and as he kind of lost sight of it, as he politically evolved over the decades, but as he understood, like certainly in like the 80s, in the 70s, right? I mean, like back when he was like a college Trotskyist, like there is, you don't actually have to pick, right? Like you can oppose two two forces that are both bad and are fighting with each other at the same time, right? I mean, like that's the whole, I mean, that's kind of the whole point of being a Trotskyist, right? That, you don't have to choose like between being a Reagan apologist and a Brezhnev apologist, right? And so I think he's losing sight of that. And then, in this last decade. And then I think the second way it goes wrong, I think we've really seen like in the last 20 years, like very dramatically, like in like last year, I think with the sort of way the war in Afghanistan ended, we really saw it, which is that, look, put aside any questions you might want to ask about the morality of these wars and all the people who are being killed, all the civilians who are being killed, put aside any questions about the intentions of the United States in waging these wars, like, how much did, George W. Bush really want democracy in the Middle East, which I think the obvious correct answer is to the exact extent that it jived with American interests and no further, right? Put aside all of those questions and just say, look, clearly, I think what the like Saigon in 1975 ending to the war in Afghanistan should have really showed us, and like everything the 20 years leading up to this, is that putting aside the morality of it, the United States just doesn't have the capacity to remake these societies in our image. That we spent God knows how many trillions of dollars that we could have been spending on healthcare, on like trying to prop up this client state in Afghanistan, and killed God knows how many people in the effort. And we could and the result of that wasn't a society that was stable or popular enough to last literally a day in the absence of American troops. Like literally while we were still getting American troops out, it was already collapsing and gone. I mean, that I think that should, like whatever else you want to say about this, I mean, we've run the experiment and it's just not going to happen that way. Like no matter how I mean, governments don't get much more evil than the Taliban, right? I would love to there be, democratic revolution and social progress in Afghanistan, but I think you just got to say empirically, like, for that to work in any kind of stable, durable way, it's just got to come from inside the society.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good answer. And when you talk about the left making the sort of worst assumptions about people who don't take their side on everything, I mean, my favorite of the explanations was that, and I didn't even know that this was a thing until I read it in your book, was that he had too much whiskey in his brain. Like, until his last day, he could run circles in a debate around people who were wrong. Like, I didn't read the chapter because I wanted to read as much of it as I could before we did this show, but I didn't read the chapter where you break down the 9 debates. But I remember the debate against George Galloway, where like Hitchens is completely wrong, Galloway is right on most of his points, and he's still, like, by the second hour, he had Galloway in shambles. Galloway was a mess. Galloway was just screaming, "Damn you! You were a butterfly. Now you are a slug." He lost it. He couldn't keep up. Even when Hitchens was wrong, he could still fucking kill you in a one-on-one debate. So I don't buy the whiskey thing. But anyway, as it pertains to like the left sort of making bad assumptions about people who aren't on their side, this kind of segues into the second thing I want to talk about before we wrap, which was your piece in the Daily Beast about the Joe Rogan Spotify deal. So since Russell, you've been quiet so far, I'll throw it to you to kick off this last segment here.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask about 2 of your articles. One, you said you felt that Hitchens would have been very much against the anti-CRT movement, feeling that it would have been peering over the shoulders of teachers. But you also point out that he probably wouldn't have been thrilled with the left side either. So what do you mean by that? In what sense?
Yeah. So if you imagine, and again, I know in some ways this is a little bit harder than the 2016 scenario we were running through earlier, because just more time has passed. The world has changed in more ways since Hitchens died at the end of 2011. So I think when you think about Hitchens surviving until 2022, in most ways, it just becomes like, the more years you imagine passing in that scenario, the harder it gets to predict what he would have thought, right? For obvious reasons. But on this one, I actually think we can be pretty confident because I think there are sort of lifelong views that he held that were like pretty core to him, that like would have led him to just hate these laws. And I also think, of course, as you allude to, that like if you think about these kind of like culture wars about, quote unquote wokeness that, are sort of ravaging the United States right now, I also don't think, I mean, like, I wanted to sort of throw this into the piece just for the sake of like fairness and accuracy, right? That like, so nobody like gets this wrong, right? Like, look, do I think that he would have reserved all of his ire for like the anti-woke side of the culture war? Definitely not, right? Like, I think that like if Christopher Hitchens had lived to 2022, he would have been like canceled like 50 times by now. And like no question, right? Like, he would have, and like, some of them he would have deserved and some of them he wouldn't, but whatever, right? That's a separate question. Like,
what was the line about Mother Teresa? He called her a dwarf of some kind.
Yeah.
But it was so good.
He called her a thieving Albanian dwarf.
A thieving Albanian dwarf.
Wow.
So yeah,
he'd be right off Spotify.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you everybody for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe wherever you saw it, on YouTube, on Rumble, or on Facebook. We have channels on all 3 of those platforms. Also, consider helping us create more content by becoming a member at patreon.com/do-dissidents, or on Facebook, where you can become a supporter right through our Facebook page and get bonus content every week, as well as call-in access to our live stream shows. Thank you very much for your continued support.